Jane Oates, come on stage. Jane, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Keith. How are you?
Good. Jane and I were having a big disagreement backstage about who was supposed to interview who. There was a legitimate disagreement about this, but I'm the reporter, so I'm going to start.
Those who know me, don't you bet I'll get a few questions in?
Jane, let's just start with some level setting. WorkingNation, I know, is doing important work across the board, but you also care about climate deeply, and I know recognize not just the imperative to address climate change, but the opportunity that's there. You know, when I think about the energy transition that's ahead of us, I think of it almost as the biggest collective action challenge in human history. We've got to rebuild our entire energy system, and that's an enormous amount of work, and that's an enormous amount of jobs. When you look at that broad challenge ahead of all of us in the years and decades ahead, where do you see is the biggest opportunity, especially when we're thinking about people on the front lines, people who haven't maybe benefited from economic mobility as much as they ought to for the last 50 years, and how they can be a part of this transformation too?
So the people in this audience are the ones that are going to make sure that we all hope tech would be the great equalizer. We hope that women and people of color would get great jobs in tech, maybe in the future, but not today. I think there's a real commitment to make sure that green jobs become the equity index, the place where everybody has the opportunity. And first, we have to explain to them, and we're so lucky, we're in the middle of, we've done 6 states, deep dives into states, because quite frankly, I was part of the Obama administration, and we put money out for green jobs prematurely. We trained people to install solar panels, we trained them in wind turbine technicians, and there were no jobs.
Right.
But now the jobs are there. So we have to convince people that yes, there's energy transition. And we're not saying that there's not going to be great fossil fuel jobs. I mean, oil and petroleum are going to be around longer than I am. Yeah. But those companies are really changing the skills that are necessary for the jobs. They're greening. And what we've done is, instead of doing a BLS kind of look, where you look at projections and pray and hope, we're going to each state, and in partnership with Burning Glass, MC Burning Glass, we have really looked at what are the jobs that exist today and what do they pay. And we've looked at those green jobs that are new, you know, electric cars, batteries, transmission, all that kind of stuff, as well as turbine and solar. But we've also looked at green adjacent jobs. How are the skill sets changing for jobs that have existed for decades? So you think of it, how has the job of a landscaper changed? Waste management, recycling, how have those jobs changed? And how can the people in this audience make sure that people get the skills they need to qualify for those jobs? Because our research is pretty clear. These are quality jobs that are paying family-sustaining wages.
That's terrific. And that's, I think, just the kind of message that everyone here is eager to hear. I want to challenge you a bit, though. Do you really believe that the biggest employers in this nation get what you just said? Are they investing the necessary training, resources, and workforce development and the capital expenditures to make the kind of systems change that you just articulated? Is that work really happening?
So I think some of it is, and I think it may be, I hope it is, one of the positive takeaways from the pandemic, that we've heard all day about how workers have gained voice. Not necessarily in the traditional way, as I was growing up through organized labor, although I think organized labor is having a great comeback. But I think they're voting with their feet. They're young people and older, more mature workers are going into prospective employers and saying, you know, what's your commitment to ESG?
Right.
What's your commitment to me? How are you going to invest in me? But how are you going to help? Because I don't want to have the beach in Miami 2 miles in. You know, I don't want to live in a place where I'm losing land. And I certainly don't want to see, you know, the weather changes that we've seen, the superstorms. So I think if we get all employers to change, it's going to be because there were some good leaders, unlike your book. There were some good leaders who did it from the top. But also at the same time, workers were doing it from the bottom up.
Yeah, I concur with most of what you said. And I don't, though, want to underestimate just how difficult it is to change corporations, right? That's really one of the hardest things. But what you mentioned, this sort of a shift in sentiment, and I think we've all felt it, and certainly as a reporter, I've been writing about it, chronicling it for the last, really, I would say 7 or 8 years. There has been this sort of shift in the ethos of business. And you can find evidence in all the talk about stakeholder capitalism and the Business Roundtable statement from 2019, sort of redefining the purpose of the corporation to look beyond the bottom line. And as I see it, that all is a recognition by at least the CEOs that the way things have been working for the last 40 years are not working. And when you look around our country and see the magnitude and the depth of some of the problems we are confronting as a society, I think a lot of executives now recognize that directly or indirectly, the choices they have made and the choices their predecessors have made have been a part of that story too.
Well, I think we're seeing a new leadership. I mean, are CEOs still paid enormous salaries with too many zeros? Absolutely. And while workers are still struggling in those same companies. But the reality is that when you have people like Doug McMillan at Walmart, like Nick Pinchuk at Snap-on Tools, who really walk through and talk to their workers and know who they are, know them by name, that's a game change. Your boyfriend here wasn't doing that.
All right. Jane is alluding to the fact that a week ago today, I published a new book. It's called The Man Who Broke Capitalism: How Jack Welch Gutted the Heartland and Crushed the Soul of Corporate America, and How to Undo His Legacy.
And David was the president of his fan club until he died a few years ago. And we don't know each other. We didn't know each other until today. But I read the book. And I'm not saying this because I want to make David rich. But this is a book that everybody who cares about people should read. If you're in the public workforce system, you should read it and have it as a book club for your members, because I want to talk about some things. I told you I'd get my questions in. I want to talk to you about things. Jack Welch, and full disclosure, was the CEO of a company in Massachusetts. I worked for the senior senator of Massachusetts, so I know the people that were raped and pillaged by him were people that I had to talk to and had to see suffer, when they lost their job, because Mr. Welch had a policy. What was his policy every year to make sure his business was healthy and flourishing?
I think you're alluding to what he euphemistically called the vitality curve, but what was more accurately known as stack ranking or rank and yank. And this is the process by which executives tell their managers to sort all of their employees into 3 categories: A, B, and C players. You can have 20% in the top, the A players, 70% are B players, and 10% are C players. And those 10% are shown the door systematically every year. And
every year, 10% of the employees got laid off no matter what.
He viewed that as an inherently good thing, right? Without giving thought to the consequences of an action like that. And that may seem like ancient history, but it's not. In the book, I chronicle how management practices like that Welch pioneered became part of the DNA, the very fabric of corporate America. It showed up at Microsoft under Steve Ballmer's tenure. It showed up more recently at Uber and WeWork. And even just last week, Elon Musk said he was having bad vibes about the economy, so he was going to fire 10% of his employees, right? And it's these kind of changes to the very way companies operate that in this book I trace back to the legacy and management of this one man.
And he had a nickname. It was Neutron Jack. Could you explain to the audience why his nickname was Neutron Jack?
I will, but I also want to acknowledge that he was able to overcome that nickname, and that's an important part of the story too. So within the first couple of years of Welch taking over General Electric in 1981, mind you, GE was one of the most influential gold standard companies in the country. This was the company that other CEOs, other companies looked to for guidance on how to comport themselves, like what a CEO, what a company was supposed to be. GE was the standard bearer. And Jack Welch arrives in 1981 and immediately sets to work firing not just 10%, but huge swaths of the population. In a series of just a couple years, unleashes a series of mass layoffs and factory closures that helps destabilize the American working class, full stop. In the wake of that, Newsweek magazine dubs him Neutron Jack, and it's a reference to the neutron bomb, which purportedly kills people while leaving the building standing. So that was what people saw early on, but then he overcame it. GE stock started to rise. He found lots of other ways to inflate GE's revenues and profits, and he goes on to be CEO of this company for 20 years and is ultimately named by Fortune magazine as he retires Manager of the Century. And so you can even see the shift in our societal priorities during his tenure from a media ecosystem, which I'm now a part of, from a society that was willing to sort of call it for what it was, Neutron Jack in the early years, to a fast forward nearly 20 years later, celebrating that kind of behavior and naming him Manager of the Century. And that's the world we're still living in today.
So I want to kind of go to a positive note. So that's really bad corporate leadership. Let's talk about what have you seen, because you now have switched to the climate desk, but you're still doing your corporate corner where you talk to CEOs all the time. What are the positive trends you're seeing in new CEOs, and especially in these emerging companies like in the green technologies that we at WorkingNation have like uncovered in these reports?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about that I think points to the reality that many CEOs today are approaching their jobs with a fundamentally different set of values, set of perspectives than the ones that Jack Welch embodied. But I'll just be quick to note, and I'll come back and sort of hit some bright spots in a minute. I'll be quick to note that the incentive systems really haven't changed around them. So while they can bring to their jobs a real willingness to lead with heart and try to look after their workers, there are very few guardrails that sort of encourage them to really take those actions, something we were having a conversation about earlier today. On those bright spots, though, we can go down the list and point to ways in which I think on balance, the tenor, like the behavior of leadership has changed, right? When the best CEOs out there today get rated by their workforce and have relationships, they do so often with a level of emotional intelligence that you couldn't point to Jack Welch and say he was indicative of. When CEOs, I think, especially in the last few years, have the opportunity to raise wages and to improve conditions for frontline workers, we're obviously seeing many examples of that, and we can point to that. And I think more broadly, there's a recognition among executives that if they want to be talent magnets, they have to stand for something beyond the bottom line. And that's something I suspect many people in this room resonate with. So on a whole bunch of levels, you can point to not only, I think, thematic changes in executive leadership over the last few years that have taken us sort of away from that Jack Welch paradigm of leadership, but you can also point to individual stories. I think it was here at JFF just last year that I interviewed Dan Schulman, the CEO of PayPal. And what they've done with their financial wellness program is really remarkable, right? They figured out all these levers they can pull to really improve the lives of some of their poorest, let's just call it like it is, their poorest workers. And they're going ahead and doing that. But that's case by case, that's company by company. And I am really of the mind that we cannot rely on magnanimous CEOs to get us out of this mess. It's going to take a whole lot more than that. It's going to take the nonprofit sector. It's going to take consumers and employees calling for change. And it's going to take the government finding out where policy can be a part of the solution too.
Yeah, because, one of the things that this horrible leadership did was really contribute to the rise of economic inequality. and the lack of economic mobility. I mean, people didn't get promoted the way they should have, and certainly diverse people didn't get even the chance to get in the door in many cases. But so what do you think, you talked about changes in policies. What do you think are some policies that would really make a difference?
Yeah. It's important just to note that we're not just being hyperbolic here. You can look at the data. And it was in 1981, the year Jack Welch took over, and the year that some of the changes in GE labor practices started really unspooling across the country and giving permission for other companies to do the same thing, right? Before Jack Welch, no company had laid people off just to improve its profit margins, right? That began in the early 80s at GE, and it took hold across the country. But it was that moment that the gap between worker pay and productivity started diverging. Right? These two trend lines had gone up in tandem for the decades after World War II, and then they split, and it just kept getting wider. So this is not just hyperbole. The data backs up these assertions we're making. As for what policy changes could change some of this, listen, a minimum wage, that is not $70.25 an hour at the federal level, is a good place to start. If the minimum wage had simply kept pace with inflation alone, it'd be more than $25 an hour today. So when people call for, the fight for 15 is great, but that's still woefully inadequate to make up for the damage that has been done. And listen, I can talk about other policy solutions that some people say could go ways to sort of narrowing the income inequality that we face in this country. And they would be things like taxing share buybacks, for example, putting ratios on CEO to median worker pay. There is a long list of policy solutions, but these days I'm not holding my breath for action from Washington.
Well, and look, I think that's why it's so important as people are training young people in high school, in community college, in four-year college, in graduate school, it's not just to talk about the GE case study. Right. It's to talk about companies who do good while they're doing well. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I think that's an answer. But I know our time is coming to an end, and I don't want to lose sight of this. I mean, what do you think the response is going to be to your book?
The response is out there. People are talking about this. I mean, people want to have this conversation because I think there's a sense, even for young people in the workforce who never heard of Jack Welch, maybe never heard of GE, I think there's a sense that something's screwed up, right? That the economy just isn't working in the same way. And I think I can get this quote right, but when my book came out, Bette Midler tweeted about it. And Bette Midler said, "Workers of America, do you want to know why your lives are so shitty? 2 words, this prick." That was Bette Midler, but I'll take it. And that's what I'm trying to do here, right? Is to start a conversation about the reality that we collectively, as a society, get to shape our economy. And the way things have been moving for the last 50 years have not been good for so many working families across this country. But in that same breath is the possibility, right? It's us. It's our executives. It's our politicians who make these decisions. And so what I describe in this book is a series of decisions that had really disastrous impacts on our economy. That means that there's a series of decisions that executives can take about the allocation of resources, about the distribution of the wealth that our corporations create, that can start to undo some of that damage.
And as you're out there training people, train your entrepreneurs to be good civic-minded employers. Train your people, your workers that you're training to have their voice. Yeah. And I think I walked away from this book thinking, the best thing that we can do to make sure that this kind of thing is minimized in the future is to make sure everybody knows they have a right to demand good working conditions, fair pay, and opportunity.
Yeah. Let me kick it back to Jane for the final question. When you have this perspective, and you've had the opportunity to work with Senator Kennedy, to work inside the Obama administration, to work very closely with big corporations that are out there employing hundreds of thousands, millions of people. Are you hopeful right now? Do you sense that there's any sort of substance to that change in sentiment that I've been covering, this move towards sort of a more enlightened capitalism? Or given your experience, I don't know, where do you stand on this?
So I am much more attached to the workforce, the public workforce system and community college and community-based organizations in my heart than I am to corporate America. So I am always hopeful, because that's where change is, that's where hope is. Their whole reason for being is to make other people's lives better. But the time that I spend, like you just interviewed Michelle Armstrong with Aries. I mean, Aries are what we would think of his buddies, right? I mean, they're venture capitalists, and they're doing this incredible work. So I am really upbeat. I see new companies, startups being very different. I see tried and true companies like Aries, like Golden Tree, these other management companies really being out there saying, no, we want a better equal playing field, and we want a better world. We want to care about community. So I'm really optimistic, and I don't think I'm Pollyanna. I really think there's a change. I think COVID has changed some of, the Ebenezer Scrooges, as well as it's changed the Tiny Tims.
I'm going to take your positive energy and run with it for the rest of the day. Jane, thank you so much.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.